Hi folks, my name is David. I'm the minister here at Erskine Parish Church. It's great to have you connecting with us, and I'm so glad you found our online resources. If you were to come into our physical church, you would get one of these welcome packs, so consider this your digital welcome. However you've joined us, we'd love it if you could like and subscribe to our platform. That allows you to continue to see when we're putting up new content. And also, if you'd like to get in touch and actually connect with us, you can email at epcnotices@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you. I was up in the Highlands on a kind of intensive thing the last couple of days for my master's studies at university, and it's my final year, doing it part-time, so I'm coming to the dissertation, and one of my biggest problems in doing it is actually starting something. So if any of you have ever been either tasked with something at work and it feels a wee bit bigger than you, or certainly if you've been involved in having to write essays and papers, my biggest problem is actually just getting started. And when I do, I usually find it goes better than I thought and it starts to flow. But I was having some pretty agonizing conversations about not really being able to decide on what I want to do and whether to start or not. So that's something I'm still in the process of learning about and learning to improve my approach to it and kind of win the battle in my mind with it a wee bit. And it's hard to know when the right time to start is, because my biggest problem with it is always, I don't know if I've done enough reading and research yet. I don't think I know enough about this topic to really start writing anything on it. And there's no blueprint. Everyone's different. Some people, it doesn't take them that much reading and the flow starts to come, when they begin writing or they begin doing the job, or the thing figures itself out for them and becomes obvious as they start doing it. The point we come to in Nehemiah building the wall is where he actually just needs to start the job. But he's done a really good amount of preparation up to this point. We thought about last week how the people of Judah and Jerusalem were in exile for well over 100 years, and so they'd lost their connection to their homeland. That wasn't just about being far away from home, it was also the religious and spiritual significance of the fact that the place that God had promised would always be there as an emblem of his presence, the temple in Jerusalem, that had been smashed to pieces. And so they had that kind of internal crisis of, what does this mean about the reality of God and the reality of our faith? So it was a crisis of faith as much as anything. And he's far away now. We thought about last week about how the empire changed hands various times, and eventually it lands today in Nehemiah's day, about 400 BC, and it's the Persian Empire. And they are much more relaxed about people having their own faith and religion and encourage them to go back in waves to try and rebuild the seat of their faith and religion. And Nehemiah happens to be at the right place at the right time. So last week, we read that he was cupbearer to the king at the end of the chapter, and that was going to be important. So this week, we're going to see how in a kind of several days long party in Persia, that becomes really significant. So I want to think about, firstly, that idea of timing and tact and how Nehemiah is really wise and uses it skillfully to move the story of God's people onwards. But then I want to look at, a bit like I was saying to the kids, about his ability to treasure the things that God's revealed to him. And then lastly, I want to look at the bold steps that he takes to get things started. So, timing and tact, treasuring God's revelation, and taking some bold steps. Let's look at, firstly, his timing. So in the month of Nisan, that time's important, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, wine was brought for him for Nehemiah as cupbearer to start serving. I took it and I gave it to the king. The hint at the month means that since we found Nehemiah in chapter 1, 4 months has elapsed. Now, we saw in chapter 1 that he had a reaction when he heard about the state of Jerusalem, that it was smashed to pieces. He was in kind of grief and trouble. And that went on for about 4 months. And that was common practice in the Old Testament, that you mourned in sackcloth and ashes. It was an outward expression of the inner turmoil in your heart, because you felt so heavily for the people of God and their cause. So he spent 4 months doing that. And then 4 months of probably doing his job, being cupbearer to the king, getting on with it. His job is kind of the... if you see it on telly, or if you've ever been fortunate enough to be at one, at a fancy kind of drinks reception, the people going around with the more champagne, please. He's in charge of all these guys, and that's his job for the king, for the ruler Artaxerxes. So he's the head, one of those guys, and he spent 4 months getting on with it quietly. Now, the fact that his face was sad and the king notices that's important. You and I read that and we think, well, we all know somebody who looks sad sometimes, but in the amount of power, the untrammeled power that the Persian emperors had, to look like that in front of them could be a death sentence. They could just decide, you know what, don't really want to look at that sad face today, I can just have you killed. So he's actually being a bit risky and jeopardizing something by even giving the slightest hint of what's going on with him personally. But anyway, he does, and I hadn't been sad in his presence before, obviously, because it could have cost him his life. And then the king asked me, why does your face look sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart. So that implies that the king actually knows him quite well, because he's able to distinguish between, well, I don't think you've got the flu, I think you're actually kind of down, I think there's something kind of weighing on you, and he's able to see that in him. And then he sees his moment, and he takes it. He sees the open goal. But it takes enormous courage, because remember, I don't know who among you were here when we did Esther. I think it was in the pandemic days. But it was the same thing. She goes to an emperor, and she's got the opportunity to ask for what she wants, make a request. But again, making that request of such a powerful emperor can go really badly, and you can end up losing your life if they don't like the request. So he's spent 4 months praying. He's got this kind of conviction that he's got something to do with what God's going to do with his people next. He's been placed strategically and positioned by God in this cupbearer position, and now the king is actually asking, what's up with you? So he musters this enormous courage, and he actually says, he tactfully says, my people, this is the problem. Why should my face not look sad when the city where my ancestors are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed by fire? I mean, the wisdom and the tact that he has. He doesn't just lead with saying, actually, can I just have all the stuff? He does say that later. But the first thing he does is he makes a human connection. He realizes that Artaxerxes, as well as being a powerful emperor, he's also a person made in the image of God. And they share humanity. And so he speaks to him about the personal rather than the political. He says to him, my ancestors, who I love and my people, they're being desecrated. And Artaxerxes also has ancestors, and he knows what it is to care for family, but also to have people that you're proud to be a part of a lineage. And that's the point of connection that he makes, really skillfully. And then it opens up the conversation about, okay, what can I do for you? But he uses timing and tact, and he's able to be used, and he's able to deploy wisdom to do that. And there's so much in here for us, but there's something there about knowing the timing. And I think the time that he spent in prayer is really helpful for that. Because a bit like, starting the essay, when do you stop reading and when do you start writing? That's often my biggest dilemma. The bigger life stuff, prayer is actually enormously helpful for. It's the time he spent praying that gives him probably enough courage to go, this is probably the time. Can give him a bit of a knowing in his heart, okay, it's time for me to move on and to give this thing a go. And to say this, the prayer would have certainly fortified him and given him the courage that he needed, but it gave him the sense that the time was right, and it probably wouldn't have been a few months earlier. Ecclesiastes, the kind of very complicated book in the Old Testament, but often read at funerals, Remembrance Day, and we all know a lot of whether you think you do or not, you probably know loads of verses from chapter 3. There is a time for everything. A time to be born and a time to die, a time to sow and a time to reap, a time to laugh and a time to cry. And so much of growing in faith and connection and relationship to God is being able to kind of tell the time, if that makes sense, is being able to tell the time that you're in, when is the time to strike, when is the time to move forward with something. And he shows us that time in prayer is really connected to timeliness, then making good decisions and moving forward. So time and tact, and that works out really well. And then next, he seems to have this enormous reverence where he just treasures what God has revealed to him. So he the king said to him, what do you want? And then he, fine, I wasn't going to do this. I'll do it as a quick aside. You know how we've been talking about prayer a lot? The king said to him, what is it you want? Then I prayed to the God of heaven, and I answered, the king, if it pleases the king and your servants has found favor in his sight, let them send me to the city in Judah where my ancestors are buried so that I can rebuild it. So the king asks him, he prays, and then he answers. It's perfectly legitimate to do that thing that many of us often do, but we wonder, is that okay? Does God accept it? You know, when you say like a millisecond prayer because you're scared or you're not sure how to proceed next. So he does that there. He prays in the moment, and it gives him a bit of fortitude and courage and direction. So that's fine. But then he asks for a lot. He asks for papers to get safe passage, because he kind of seems to know, he seems to have a bit of awareness that he's probably going to encounter opposition, and people are going to say, what right have you got to come through here and to do this? So he kind of gets the equivalent of the king's signet to give him safe passage all the way through in a way that's not questioned. He then also asks for the king's storehouses of lumber and treasure to be opened up, so he has enough material and basically finances to build it. He knows that he's going to need somewhere to stay, so he's like, can you give me a residence while I'm there? So the king opens all of this up for him, and he goes for it. And then, I love this, but this is kind of, I think, one of the original covert missions that you find come from verses 13 to 16. I went out through the valley gate, and then he goes through a series of gates, which you can look up a map of Jerusalem, and it's quite interesting. And then I moved on, and he is quietly going through, and then eventually he has to get off his animal because there's not enough space in some of the bits. And we reckon that we've excavated part of this. We reckon that the siege that Babylon had done to destroy Jerusalem, there were so many piles of rubble on one side of the city that it was impassable apart from tiny wee cracks that he would have had to walk through, but no animal would have been able to get through. So then the officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, because as yet I'd said nothing to the Jews or priests or nobles or anyone else who would be doing the work. He has a sense of commission and calling, and I didn't have time to go into that last week so much, but he knows that God has sort of laid his hand on him to do a very special job. And we're going to find later on that there's going to be quite a bit of conflict with some of the other people who are around, in and around at the time. In fact, there's a wee bit of it in this chapter. There was a hint at it when he began to set off. In verse 10, Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite heard about what he was going to do, and they were distressed someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. All aims in warfare, the whole idea of espionage and intelligence, that comes about because the more that you know is great, but then the more that someone that opposes you know about what you know, then that has the potential to massively frustrate what it is you're going to do. And so this is not just a religious thing, it's a timeless principle that knowledge is power. And if you hold it, then it gives you agency. But if that then can be tapped into, then it can be really destructive. And so he has seen that. He's probably heard that these guys are beginning to oppose it for what seems no good reason. We can explore some of the reasons later. But he is thinking, God has asked me to do this. And so to spread it out, he also doesn't know who he can trust. If you watch anything like, there's some great ones, not just Bletchley Park, there's that obviously, but there's Operation Mincemeat, all these kind of covert, the way espionage really began to grow up in the Second World War. It was all about being able to preserve the knowledge that they had, which ultimately would lead to preserving life. And this would lead to preserving and building up the city again into fulfilling what God had really impressed upon his heart. But he needs to kind of tread carefully, and he needs to keep treasuring it. And he finds it so precious, what God's asked him to do, that he's willing to just sneak about, carry it in his own heart, not tell others what he's doing. And as I was saying to the kids, there's just an amazing principle to that in not necessarily giving everything away all of the time, particularly when there could be opposition or the possibility of being undermined in it. There was a really good study, a psychological one done a good number of years ago now, but it was looking into this idea of the fact that sometimes sharing our goals And whether that's our very practical, normal goals or the calling God's placed on our life or what we feel he's asked us to do, sometimes the more we share that, the more it can detract from its power. Let me tell you about, they did one really practical study where they got 2 groups of lawyers, I think it was 45 in each group, and they gave them a test to do, a bit of like a legal exam. And in the first group of 45, they took them aside and they said, is this your correct answer? Is this the answer that you circled? And then they got to get them to discuss in detail why they circled that answer. And then the other group, it was totally anonymous. They didn't get them to say anything about it. They then put them both groups into a harder legal test case that they had to write on after that. And amazingly, the ones who got to share and talk about their reasonings just before, they didn't do very well. Whereas the ones who had quietly put the slip in, they actually did a lot better in the test. And it's a psychological principle that when you tell, the more times you tell and the more people that you tell about whatever goals that you do, it almost starts to take away from it or diminish it. There's lots of reasons. It can make you start to think you've somewhat achieved it because you've told people about it. But there's also the real thing of when you're looking at information, intelligence, when you're looking at precious things, anything that's precious to you, that can start to water it down. Or, indeed, if you give very vulnerable things about yourself into the wrong hands, they can absolutely use it to destroy you. So there's a real, human principle to that. But again, Nehemiah's not perfect, and he's not always going to be wise, but in chapter 2, he's wise, and he not only proceeds with tact, but he shows us what it is to, some of us will have had those profound spiritual experiences where God is with you, you maybe really feel his presence, and you might even get a physical manifestation of it. Some people talk about it like a warmth going through their body, or, who am I to, I'm giving you a couple of examples, but probably as many people as there are in here, there are different experiences of what that is like. And I think the encouragement is to, if God has done anything with you, it's precious, and for us to be careful and tactful about who we share that with, because that's treasure that he's given us and been able to experience it. And of course, the more practical application of knowledge being power, but also of us then having the good sense to guard our hearts, as Proverbs says, and as we thought about a few weeks ago. So he treasures what God's given him, as well as moving forward with tact. And then finally, he just has a go. He sets out and he does the work. In verse 17, he says, "Then I said to them, you see the trouble we are in. Jerusalem lies in ruins, and its gates have been burned with fire. Come, let us rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, and will no longer be in disgrace." So the first thing he does is he has a really honest appraisal of where they are. And, sometimes there can be a characterization that, and people outside the church will sometimes say to me, why do you believe a book of fairy stories? As if we're very ethereal people and we don't have any groundedness or reality. But you can't have an honest reading of the Bible and come away thinking that you're meant to live like that. You're meant to live in the real world. And you're meant to be grounded and realistic and survey whether it's... that's what we do in the prayer of confession every week. We survey the condition of our own hearts and we go, yeah, you know what? Not perfect, not the finished article yet. Need God's help here. In some sense, the whole of the Christian life is, I need God's help here. But he surveys and he's like, guys, this is a state. We're in trouble here. But the beautiful thing about Christianity is, as much as it's realistic about the state of our world, the state of our hearts, all of that, it also has somewhere that it's taking us and somewhere that it wants us to go. He says, the gates have been burned with fire, so disaster. Come, let us rebuild the wall of Jerusalem, and we will no longer be in disgrace. And he knows his Old Testament. He's wanting to give them a vision of somewhere where they can be that is more akin to what they understood that God had promised for them, that there was a good hope and future over the horizon, that God wanted to rebuild them into a people that would show his love and his promise to the surrounding nations, because that was a huge part of the promise that God gave the Israelite people, that this wasn't the final end marker, the last chapter in their story in relating to God. And he had the temerity and also the vision to be able to see that and to pull other people along with him. He's saying, come, yes, it's bad. Yes, it's awful. But, and this is in many ways the hope of the gospel. If the gospel is nothing else and does nothing else, it should give us perpetual hope. Because it's a bit like, the worst thing the world has ever done was crucify and put the Son of God to death. But out of that rises a hope that all people everywhere at any time are able to find themselves in the middle of. And they're able to see the darkest day for the Son of God and indeed the Father God, and see that for them, that is their greatest hope, because that's what made possible for all their sin to be lifted away and for them to know the power and the extent of God's own love for them. Do you see? So the gospel is something amazing in that it always leads us toward honest appraisal and engagement with that. But it never leaves us there, and it takes us toward greater hope with our eyes set on Jesus, particularly on the cross, but even more so, we're a resurrection people. We're a people where God says that the story is never done, that the coffin is never finally sealed, because we believe in resurrection, hope, and life. And then I think that it's that hope and that vision being set on that enables them then to get through the opposition. Because here's kind of here's the reality of living with that hope in very much a fallen world and creation. We're always going to have detractors. We're always going to have opposition. Sanballat and Tobiah in verse 10, they don't like what he's doing. They were disturbed that someone had come to promote the welfare of the Israelites. Why would that be? Why not? Surely that would be a good thing. Well, these guys are both gotten pretty prominent positions. They're both governors. They're both in the setup as it is now in the ruins. They're like probably people who enjoy managing chaos and decline, because at least they know how to do that and it looks good. The next thing for them is probably unthinkable. And they're probably thinking, being human beings, I'm going to lose my wee position here, because this Nehemiah guy is going to overshadow all of us if he pulls this off. And my wee corner of it. One of them's an Ammonite, so they've got a natural hostility to the people of Israel. So he's got a hidden agenda, if you like, or not so hidden. He doesn't do a good job of hiding it. So they come up and they ridiculed us, it says. What are you doing? Are you rebelling against the king? Here's the other thing they tried to do. Tried to strike fear in him. They tried to go, I'm going to grass you in and get the king on you. Now, Nehemiah already has the authority of the king to do this. So that shouldn't work. But just because it shouldn't work and it's not rational, we are not entirely rational creatures. And if someone comes and says, I'm going to flip and phone the law on you, then your initial reaction is to go, oh my goodness, what have I done? So they tried to do that. And I love his answer, because this is the other thing is there's always going to be opposition, detraction. Not everyone's always going to like you or agree with you. And there are, we've seen this before in Proverbs and we see it again with them. There's guys who, it didn't matter if you were delivering the new heavens and the new earth. They'd find a way to complain about it, because that's just the way they move through life. So he answered them by saying, the God of heaven will give us success. We are servants, we start rebuilding, but as for you, you have no share in Jerusalem or any claim or historic right to it. So he doesn't mince his words. But notice what he doesn't do. He doesn't launch into a justification. He doesn't explain the timeline and go, well, actually, I was cupbearer to the king. And because he's got the kind of sense to go, God has asked me to do, he's so sure of his call. God has asked me to do this. He's not asked me to work with you, and he's not asked me to explain anything to you. So you're not actually owed that. And not everybody that does always ask us questions. Some people will make us feel like we're owe them a huge explanation. And we don't always. And that's not always relevant to the work of God. But he doesn't justify himself to them. He takes it to God. And there's a sense in which, what the psalmists have found, the psalmist and people who find their strength in the Psalms have found over the centuries and the millennia. God is our refuge and our strength. If God is for us, who can be against us? And that's not, that's not something that we use to steamroller our way over anyone or anything. That is just a refuge that God gives us, that if we're pressed in against and we're encountering a lot of opposition, whether that's in our normal work, in our jobs or relationships or church or whatever it is, that if God has really spoken to us and if God is really guiding our lives, that we can have that confidence that whatever difficulty and opposition that it brings, that he will see us through it. And like the psalmist, Nehemiah has that confidence that he will be vindicated by God. And he's in it for the long, it might take a while. These guys might, and we'll see in the next few chapters, they do their best, to sabotage things, and it might work for a bit, but he's got that confidence of, I know who I belong to, and I know how this is all going to shake out in the end. And God through his word gives us all that promise in the likes of the Psalms, that if we belong to him, that he will do us good. Or as Paul puts it in Romans 8, that God works all things together for the good of those who love him. And importantly, I never saw it, I'm making this up on spot, I never saw this in my notes, those who are called according to his purpose. God has called you by name, whether that's just into a relationship of faith with him, or if he's given you something more significant as well to do on top of that, that if he started it and he called you, he's not going to give up on you. And he'll see you through, and you'll be able to have that confidence that Nehemiah had, that he's given you the mind, the tact, the ability, and through prayer, that he'll sustain and strengthen you, come what may. May God bless his word to us. Amen. Thank you for tuning into our channel here at Erskine Parish Church. We create this and give it away so that it can be a blessing. Everything that we do here in the church relies on the generous backing of those who support us. And so if you would like to become one of them and give something back, then we've made it as easy as possible. You can go to erskine.parish/donate, and there you can give a one-off bank transfer. You can set up a regular standing order or donate by PayPal. You can also download a gift aid form so that if you're a UK taxpayer, it increases the contributions that way as well. Thank you so much for watching, and we pray God's blessing on you.